Quick disclaimer, information in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be treated as medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare team before making changes to your diet, lifestyle, supplementation, or medication.
Research is interesting, but it only matters if we can translate it into something meaningful that impacts people's lives. And what this episode shows is that understanding your body is far more valuable than chasing simplistic answers or quick fixes.
Welcome to Type 2 Diabetes Talk, the place where we chat about what really works to treat type 2 diabetes and prediabetes naturally with nutrition and lifestyle. If you're looking to optimize blood sugar and A1C, lose weight, reduce medications, and improve your overall health, this is the place to be. Now, here's your host, Type 2 Diabetes Nutrition Specialist, Dr. Jedha.
Hello, wonderful people. Thanks for joining me for episode 123. Today we're exploring some fascinating new studies and headlines from the world of diabetes, metabolism, weight loss, and overall health. As always, the goal here isn't just to throw research papers at you, it's to help translate what this information might actually mean in real life and how you can use it to better understand your body, your metabolism, and to improve your health. Let's start today's discussion focused on a common medication, metformin. If you've been around the diabetes space for any length of time, you've almost certainly heard of metformin. It's one of the most commonly prescribed medications for type 2 diabetes and prediabetes worldwide and has been around for decades. So naturally, you'd assume researchers and doctors fully understand exactly how it works by now, right? Well, not exactly. A new paper highlights something really fascinating and surprising. Researchers are still uncovering new mechanisms behind metformin's effects. And I think this is such an important reminder of how complex metabolism really is. For years, metformin was thought to primarily work through the liver by reducing glucose production. That's still considered part of the story, but this newer research suggests that the intestine may play a much bigger role than previously thought. What the researchers found is that metformin appears to inhibit something called mitochondrial complex 1 within intestinal cells. Now, don't worry too much about the terminology here. What's important is that mitochondria are basically the energy-producing structures inside our cells, and according to this paper, metformin may alter how intestinal cells handle energy and glucose, essentially turning parts of the intestine into what researchers describe as a kind of glucose sink. In other words, the intestine may start pulling more glucose out of circulation and using it up. That's really interesting because it helps explain some things we've observed clinically for years. Why metformin can improve post-meal blood sugar, why it increases glucose uptake in the intestine, and potentially why gastrointestinal side effects are so common. Another fascinating detail from the paper is that metformin concentrations in the intestine are dramatically higher than what's found in the bloodstream. So the intestine isn't just some passive organ sitting in the background here. It may actually be one of the major sites where metformin exerts its effect. And I think there's a broader lesson in all of this. Sometimes people talk about diabetes as though it's very simple. Blood sugar is high, just lower it. But the deeper science goes, the more we see that metabolism is interconnected with mitochondrial function, energy production, circadian rhythms, hormones, the gut, muscle, the brain, and so much more. This is also why there's rarely one single magic solution. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that science evolves. Even with one of the oldest and most widely used diabetes drugs in the world, there are still unanswered questions and new discoveries being made. So if you ever feel confused because nutrition advice or diabetes science seems to change over time, that's partly because we are all still learning. And speaking of metabolism changing throughout the day, let's move into the next study. Recently in episode 120, we spoke about whether exercise helps to lower blood sugar, and overall, the answer is yes. Alongside nutrition, movement is another powerful tool we have for improving insulin sensitivity and blood sugar control. But what about the timing of your exercise? Does that have any additional influence on blood sugar? As it turns out, this is an area of research that's becoming increasingly interesting. I've seen a few papers on this, but a new paper focused heavily on circadian rhythms, which are essentially your body's internal clocks that regulate things like hormone release, sleep and wake cycles, insulin sensitivity, energy production, and glucose metabolism. Now, in healthy metabolism, many of these systems follow fairly predictable daily patterns, but in type 2 diabetes, these rhythms can become disrupted. In prediabetes too. And one of the really interesting things the researchers discuss is that insulin sensitivity changes throughout the day. In people with type 2 diabetes, afternoon and evening exercise often appears to improve blood sugar control and insulin sensitivity more effectively than morning exercise. That doesn't mean morning exercise is bad if that suits you better, but it may help explain something many people notice with their glucose readings. For example, some people wake up with elevated fasting glucose, then go for a morning walk or workout, and their glucose actually rises instead of falls. And they think, wait, I thought exercise was supposed to lower blood sugar. But the body is more nuanced than that. In the morning, cortisol levels naturally rise, what's often called the cortisol awakening response. Combine this with the dawn phenomenon, which is where the liver is releasing more glucose into circulation due to the combination of hormones in those early hours of the morning. Well, depending on the timing, the intensity, the type of exercise, stress levels, sleep quality, and the individual person, you may see different glucose responses. But the paper also discusses how exercise acts as a time cue for the body clock. So in simple terms, movement may help reset or reinforce healthier metabolic rhythms. Now, of course, when it comes to exercise, consistency still matters more than perfection. The best exercise is still the one you'll actually do regularly, so if mornings are the only time you can exercise, that's still fantastic. But if you're someone struggling with stubborn fasting glucose or large post-meal spikes, this research suggests it may be worth experimenting with post-dinner walks, afternoon resistance training, or even short movement sessions after meals, particularly in the later part of the day. Certainly we know movement after meals is a highly effective strategy to lower post-meal glucose and A1C levels, something we talked about in episode 89. And when we look at this research, I think that's one of the biggest practical lessons here and something to remember. Your blood sugar is not static. It changes throughout the day in response to food, hormones, stress, sleep, movement, and circadian rhythms, your sleep-wake cycle. Which is why understanding your own patterns is often far more useful than chasing one perfect number, because those are the things you can continuously work on and continuously improve. But the point of this message is, and this research is, that consider trying afternoon or evening workouts instead, because they might just help your blood glucose numbers.
It's time to leave all the noise and confusion behind and get proven, practical solutions that really work. Understand your diabetes and exactly what to eat to keep your blood sugar stable, lose weight, and reduce medications. All this and more is possible with Dr. Jedha's scientifically proven T2 diet program. Take charge of your diabetes health and join the program today. Visit type2diabetestalk.com/programs.
Now let's move into one of the biggest stories in medicine right now: GLP-1 medications and obesity treatment. You've probably seen the headlines everywhere. Record-breaking weight loss, game-changing drugs, obesity treatment revolution. These days it seems that GLP-1s are everywhere, and we spoke about Ozempic and Wegovy back in episode 55, which was some time ago. But in that episode we shared many facts surrounding these medications. Recently, Novo Nordisk released new analyses from their step-up trial looking at higher dose Wegovy or semaglutide. Now, Novo Nordisk are the pharmaceutical company that are releasing these drugs, and we're talking in this new study massive dosage jumps from 2.4 milligrams a day up to 7.2 milligrams per day. The results are certainly impressive on the surface. In what they call early responders, people taking the higher 7.2 milligram dose lost an average of nearly 28% of their body weight over 72 weeks. That's pretty enormous, and there's no question these medications can produce substantial weight loss and improvements in blood sugar in many people. But I think it's important we look beyond the headline numbers and ask a deeper question. What exactly is being lost? Because when people lose weight rapidly, they're not just losing fat. They can lose muscle, bone density, water, and other metabolically important tissue. This is something we covered in episode 55, and there is research to confirm these effects. In the press release, Novo Nordisk states that 84% of the weight loss came from fat mass while muscle function was preserved. And that sounds reassuring. But there are a few important caveats here. First, the body composition analysis was only done in a very small subgroup, just 55 participants. And second, and this is important, the press release appears to combine results from both the 2.4 milligram and 7.2 milligram semaglutide groups together when discussing body composition. So that's a bit misleading because technically speaking, we don't actually know from this new analysis whether the higher dose caused greater lean mass loss. And that matters a lot because even the company reports around 10% reduction in muscle mass relative to baseline, and that's just at the 2.4 milligram dose. Now, some people might hear only 10% and think that sounds small, but muscle is incredibly important. Muscle is metabolically protective, critical for insulin sensitivity, important for glucose disposal, essential for healthy aging, balance, mobility, and long-term independence. And one of the major concerns with rapid weight loss, especially in older adults, is that regaining lost muscle is much harder than regaining fat. In fact, regaining lost muscle mass, lost bone mass is incredibly hard for anybody to regain. That's why I think we need to be careful not to reduce health down to a single number on the scales because yes, losing excess body fat can absolutely improve metabolic health. But ideally, we want fat loss while preserving muscle, preserving strength, preserving bone health, and maintaining metabolic resilience. And this is where I think the conversation around these medications sometimes becomes overly simplistic online. People get pushed into extremes, either these drugs are amazing or these drugs are terrible, but reality is usually more nuanced than that. These medications may absolutely help some people, but they are not a replacement for adequate protein intake, resistance training, movement, sleep, stress, and building long-term sustainable habits. Because ultimately, health is not just about becoming smaller. It's about maintaining a body that is metabolically healthy, physically capable, and resilient long-term. So if someone is using a GLP-1 medication, I think the conversation should shift beyond simply how much weight did you lose and instead include how much muscle was preserved. Are you maintaining strength? Are you eating enough protein? Are you physically active? How is your energy? How sustainable is this long term? Because those questions matter a lot too. So let's move into the next paper because this one is incredibly fascinating because it highlights something we don't talk about enough in diabetes and metabolic health, and that's the connection between metabolism, mood, and the brain. This study looked at insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, brain structure, and cognition in people with mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder. Now, we often think about insulin resistance purely in terms of blood sugar, diabetes, weight, or perhaps cardiovascular risk. But insulin is doing much more than just regulating glucose. The brain itself is highly metabolically active and contains insulin and leptin receptors in areas involved in memory, learning, emotional regulation, and cognition. And what the researchers found was that markers of insulin resistance and leptin dysregulation were associated with poorer cognition and structural brain changes, particularly in people with bipolar disorder. Now, this doesn't mean insulin resistance is the sole cause of mood disorders. Mental health is complex and multifactorial, but I think it reinforces the idea that metabolism and brain health are deeply interconnected, and this is something we see clinically all the time. People with insulin resistance or poorly controlled blood sugar often report brain fog, fatigue, low motivation, poor concentration, disrupted sleep, mood changes, depression, and emotional burnout. And unfortunately, many people blame themselves for these experiences. They think, I'm just lazy. I have no willpower. I can't stay motivated. But biology matters. Hormones matter. Sleep matters. Inflammation matters. Metabolic health matters. And interestingly, the paper also discusses the hormone leptin. Now, most people think of leptin simply as a satiety hormone, a hormone related to our feeling of fullness and appetite control. But leptin also plays important roles in brain signaling and cognition. When metabolic health becomes disrupted, those signaling systems may become dysregulated too. And I think this opens up a really important broader conversation that our overall metabolism and metabolic health is about far more than weight or glucose numbers. It influences how we think, how we feel, our energy levels, our resilience, and potentially even long-term brain health. It's so interesting, and it's why it's so important to take a holistic view and have patience with yourself and your body when you're working on treating your diabetes. You can make positive changes that turn your whole system around. The body is very intelligent like that, but it can take time. Now, this next one is a little more science heavy, but it's also incredibly interesting. We won't dwell on it too long, but it's another reminder that even in 2026, researchers are still uncovering completely new aspects of human metabolism. So a potentially new discovery involving mechanisms of glycogen regulation. Glycogen is basically the storage form of glucose. Think of it as stored carbohydrate, mainly in the liver and muscle tissue. The liver uses glycogen to help maintain blood glucose levels between meals and overnight, while muscles use glycogen locally during movement and exercise. So glycogen sits right at the centre of blood sugar regulation, insulin sensitivity, exercise performance, fasting glucose, and overall metabolic flexibility. And what researchers found here is that there may be a previously unrecognised mechanism involving ubiquitin, a molecule traditionally known for helping label proteins for recycling or breakdown. But now researchers are discovering it may also play a direct role in glycogen regulation itself. And some scientists involved describe this as potentially rewriting biology textbooks, which is a pretty big statement to say that they may need to rewrite those. And whenever you hear phrases like that, it's important not to get too carried away because science headlines can sometimes overstate findings, and these are relatively new findings. But I still think the bigger message here is fascinating. Our understanding of metabolism is still evolving. Even something as fundamental as glycogen, which we've known about for a very long time, may still contain hidden layers of regulation we didn't fully appreciate. And this actually connects back to many things we talk about regularly in diabetes management. It may help explain why fasting glucose can fluctuate, why stress impacts blood sugar, why exercise changes glucose handling, why some people tolerate carbohydrates differently, and why liver glucose output can become dysregulated in insulin resistance. Because underneath all of that is this incredibly complex network involving glycogen storage, glycogen release, hormones, mitochondria, cellular activity, circadian rhythms, muscle activity, and energy sensing systems. But like I said, this is very early research, so practically speaking, it doesn't suddenly change what people should do tomorrow morning. It's just so fascinating. Metabolism is dynamic, adaptive, responsive, and deeply interconnected. Let's finish with a very hopeful study, especially for those with diabetes running in the family. Because in these cases, people often think, well, I'm just destined to get diabetes. It's in my genes after all. And yes, genetics absolutely play a role in type 2 diabetes risk. But this large study reinforces something really important. Genes are not destiny. The researchers looked at more than 332,000 people from the UK Biobank and examined both genetic risk and lifestyle factors together. And unsurprisingly, people with a higher genetic risk were more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Of course, we already know that. But what's really important is what happened when lifestyle factors entered the picture. The study found that unhealthy lifestyle behaviours dramatically increase diabetes risk across all levels of genetic risk. In other words, if someone had a strong genetic predisposition, lifestyle still mattered enormously. And perhaps even more encouraging, people at high genetic risk could substantially lower their risk through healthier lifestyle habits. Now, I think this is such an important message because genetics can sometimes make people feel powerless, like the outcome is already decided. But genes are really more like a predisposition, not a guarantee. You may inherit a greater susceptibility toward insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, but environmental and lifestyle factors still strongly influence whether those genes are expressed and to what degree. And this aligns with what we see clinically all the time. Two people can have very similar family histories, but very different outcomes depending on their nutrition, movement patterns, sleep, stress levels, body composition, muscle mass, and overall health. Now, that doesn't mean lifestyle guarantees perfect protection, and it certainly doesn't mean people should blame themselves if they develop diabetes. But I think this study provides a really empowering middle ground. Your genes matter, but your daily habits matter too. And importantly, meaningful improvements in your overall health often come from relatively simple but consistent actions repeated over time. Not perfection, not extremes, not trying to biohack every aspect of your life, just steadily improving the factors we can influence. So wonderful people, I think that's a really fitting way to end today's episode. Every study we discussed today points toward the same bigger picture. Metabolism is complex, interconnected, and constantly adapting. We're still learning how medications work. We're still uncovering new biological mechanisms. We're learning that timing matters, muscle matters, sleep matters, mental health matters, and, of course, nutrition and lifestyle still matters, even in the face of genetic risk. And hopefully what this episode shows is that understanding your body is far more valuable than chasing simplistic answers or quick fixes. Because the goal isn't perfection, it's learning the patterns, making informed adjustments, and building a healthy metabolism over time. The body is very intelligent, and it has an enormous capacity to heal itself, no matter what state you may find yourself in today. Believe me, I have seen this time and time again in people completely transforming their lives. So please believe in that. All you have to do is take small, positive steps forward each and every day. And I know you're capable of doing that because in your life, you've probably done many, many difficult things. So just small, positive steps forward each and every day lead you to a positive future. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next episode. Dr. Jedha, over and out.
Thanks for tuning in to Type 2 Diabetes Talk. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. And for episode replays, episode notes, and more, visit type2diabetestalk.com. New episodes are available Tuesdays, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, or your time zone equivalent. Thanks again. We're truly grateful to be a part of your life and help make a real difference.